Welcome to the interactive lecture for Chapter 2. In this chapter, we are really going to cover that context piece of the models of communication, specifically looking at how the culture in which we are embedded in and the co-cultures that we choose to be a part of, as well as our sex and gender influence our communication with others. In this particular lecture, we're going to focus on culture and communication. So we're going to define culture and talk about the components of culture. We are going to look at the specific ways in which the culture influences our communication with others, as well as some dimensions of the cultures that we are embedded in that influence our interpersonal interactions. So let's begin with defining culture. In this chapter, and when we think about when we communicate with others, we focus on two pieces or kind of two definitions of culture. The first is general culture that we are embedded in. So this system of learned and shared symbols, language, values, and norms that we can use to distinguish one group of people from another. In this class, we're really going to think about when we say culture, we're going to focus on kind of the property of people that exist within a society. So thinking about, we are embedded in the American culture, so thinking about things that are affiliated mostly with like kind of ethnicity, and so your nationality. And when we think about culture, we sometimes think that people belong to only one culture, but we know that you can identify and belong to multiple cultures, and we would call this being multicultural. We're also going to talk about co-cultures in this chapter, and as we think about further in the semester, looking at the influence of culture on our communication with others. So unlike culture, co-cultures are not based on our nationality. These are the smaller groups to which we belong to, thinking about things like we belong to the Bloomsburg University culture. These are a group of people who have shared values, customs, and norms. Generally, if you're part of a university, you value education. We have certain customs in terms of policies on campus, different events that occur, so things like homecoming or spring weekend, right? Norms, so you have to go to class, you have to show up on time, things of that nature that all members of that group should adhere to, and there are generally consequences when you don't adhere to those kinds of social norms. So just like culture, you can identify with multiple co-cultures, and this is more common than identifying with multiple cultures. So if we can even think about cultures in terms of like social groups, right? So you belong to a certain age group, which could be a co-culture. Some of you may belong to a religion, which would be a co-culture. You have a sexual orientation. We can think about sexual orientation in terms of being a co-culture. You may be a part of the athletic team or a Greek organization, attend a certain university. So all of these things would make up a co-culture. So as we think about your different cultural and co-culture affiliations, I want you to stop and take a moment and reflect on this. So what are your own cultural affiliations? What are those larger nationality, society groups that you consider yourself belonging to? And then I also want you to think about co-cultures. So what are those social groups, smaller groups that are part of your identity that you belong to? So take a moment in the dialog box in PlayPosit and reflect on this this piece. So think about what cultures and co-cultures you are a part of. So now we are going to talk about the components of culture. So in our definition, we talked about culture being a system of learned and shared symbols, language, values, and norms. And these also exist within our co-cultures as well. So those are simply our components of culture. So when we think about symbols, we know that symbols are something that represents an idea. We talked a lot about symbols when we talked about language, so thinking about words being symbols for larger meaning. We also, in the nonverbal chapter, talked about gestures. So thinking about certain gestures can exist within a culture and mean something in one culture and not another culture. So when we think about like shaking somebody's hand in our culture, that's like social appropriateness. You're supposed to shake somebody's hand when you're meeting them for the first time. It's kind of politeness, but in other cultures it is not seen as polite. So if you go to shake somebody's hand, that's actually more of an insult. And so gestures can fluctuate from culture to culture. We also know, though, that symbols, things like, can consist of things like foods, artifacts, wearing a wedding band is to symbolize that you're married or engaged is unique to our culture and not carried on in other cultures. We can think about artifacts like the American flag and what that means for our culture, American pie, baseball. So those are some examples from a larger cultural perspective, but we can also think about that from a co-cultural perspective as well. So thinking about, within the Bloomsburg University co-culture, we have the Husky, and that represents, that group. It's the kind of like the mascot of that group, and that would be a symbol of the university. We also know within cultures that cultures use a shared language. So this allows for written and spoken communication. We talked a lot about this already, and we're going to talk more about the influence of culture and language at the end of this lecture. So we know that language ensures that a culture is passed from one generation to the next. So we use language to pass on information to others about the culture's norms, their rules, their values, all of these things, even symbols, and what they mean in that culture. We also know that language is important at a co-cultural level. So when we think about, there may be certain slang terms or jargon that may exist within certain co-cultures. So thinking about the medical community has certain language that is well understood within the medical community, but coming in from an outside perspective, you may not understand that. When we remodeled our home, we had a contractor come in and they were talking about all of these, using specifically like a painter, and he was talking about the tools that he would use and the process that he'd go through. And I remember being like, okay, well, break that down. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so he was using jargon and kind of some slang terms there that was unique to that culture. Other contractors would know what they were talking about, but somebody who's not a part of that co-culture, me, would need more explanation and wouldn't necessarily know. Cultures and co-cultures also have values. So these are the cultural standards for judging how good, desirable, or beautiful something is. So what a culture values can differ between one culture to the next. So thinking about kind of some of our American values like democracy, freedom, equal opportunity, the American dream, those are unique to our culture and may not necessarily be carried on to other nationalities and other cultures. And again, this can exist at the co-cultural level as well. And finally, we have norms. So norms are rules or expectations that guide a person's behavior. These really set the expectations for what you should and should not do as a member of that culture or co-culture. So norms also vary from culture to culture. They guide what we call politeness. They dictate oftentimes the laws and rules of that society, and this also exists within our co-cultures as well. So we can list off many of the specific rules that at the university level we call it a code of conduct, right? So if you violate that code of conduct, then you're in big trouble. You're going to be under disciplinary review. You might be expelled from the university, and that's because you violated one of the norms of the co-culture, the Bloomsburg University co-culture. So as we think about and reflect on these components of culture, I want you to reflect back on the co-cultures that you listed in your previous reflection. And I want you to pick one of those co-cultures that you talked about in that reflection, and I want you to identify what are the symbols, the language, the values, and the norms of that co-culture. So go ahead and list that for yourself, and then interact with one of the reflections from your classmates. So when we think about culture, so far we've defined culture, we've looked at some of the main components of culture, but what's really important is understanding how those things influence our communication with others. And it's important to understand because people who have different cultural backgrounds think perhaps differently. They may assign meaning differently, and that's going to influence the communication process, right? So if we are encoding things differently because of our cultural backgrounds and we're decoding or assigning meaning differently, that may impact how we interact with other people. We can even think about it from the most fundamental level of if we are using different language systems, that's going to really prevent us from being able to engage in intercultural communication. When we are communicating with people from other cultures, there are some challenges that may exist that we need to attend to. The first in the communication literature looks at this idea of in-groups versus out-groups. In-group membership would be when we communicate with people who are like us, who are either a part of our larger cultural system or a part of a co-cultural group that we are a member of. We tend to think that people in our in-group are more like us, and that people who are in out-groups, who are either not a part of our culture or who are not a part of our co-cultural groups, are more different from us than they actually are. So this is interesting. Because of this, the dynamic in-group and out-group dynamics, we, subconsciously tend to think that people who are part of our culture or in-group or co-cultures are more like us. That leads us to think more positively about them, and that may influence our communication interactions with them, right? So when we think that they're more like us, we may engage in more positive verbal communication. We may initiate interaction more freely because we perceive that similarity. And it's a double-edged sword here with the outgroups. So thinking about if we perceive that people who are not a part of a member of our groups are not like us, or more different than they actually are, we may think of them in a more negative way, and that may limit our interactions or negatively cloud the interactions that we have with them. So these in-group, out-group dynamics are really important for understanding kind of the subconscious level at which we view people within and outside of our cultures and co-cultures. And of course, these are things, dynamics that we can overcome and should work to overcome in our communication efforts. Communication scholars also study the concept of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is essentially the concept that people sometimes exhibit strong preferences for those in their in-group. So extending on some of what I just talked about, showing that if people are high in this quality, they tend to value their culture more than others, to think that they are the best. We see this sometimes in the larger dialogue, kind of political dialogue, right? Like America is the best country, they have the biggest army, everyone should be like us. Sometimes we use force to force people to have similar laws and similar values and norms, and so that would be kind of this example of having kind of a strong ethnocentric mentality. We also presume through the similarity assumption that most people think the same way that we do if they are part of our in-group. And so thinking about sharing the same values, subscribing to the same norms because they are a part of a co-cultural or cultural group that we are also a part of. And oftentimes we're over-attributing this similarity. So when we think about, being a member of of higher education or being a member of a certain religious group, right? You may think that that person has similar kind of attitudes towards things like abortion or premarital sex or other hot topics that center around religion. Maybe they're more conservative in their politics, right? But then you get to talking about them and they aren't those things. And you say, but you go to church and you're a Catholic just like me. You should think like me. But that's not necessarily the case, right? We are all very different. But because of this similarity assumption, we tend to assume that because people are a member of a certain group that we are a part of, that they also have other similarities that are like us. And that varies widely. So as we think about some of those facets of communication, there are 7 important cultural differences that we need to think about when we are communicating with others. And so these are all really central in the intercultural communication, the study of how we communicate between cultures. And so these 7 dimensions exist and they function within one another. They interact to influence kind of our interactions when we are communicating within and across cultural bounds. So a culture can vary on whether they are individualistic or collectivistic. And so the first dimension is individualism versus collectivism. And this is the idea of whether a culture emphasizes the needs of the individual or the needs of the group. So thinking about if a more individualistic cultures emphasize individuals rather than the group, you should just be yourself. You should look out for yourself. Whereas more collectivistic cultures emphasize responsibility to the larger society or subgroups within that society, specifically the family. So you're thinking about, having a greater emphasis on loyalty to the family or workplace or community rather than the needs of the individual. And we see that this idea or value varying between cultures. Cultures also value in the emphasis that they place on kind of contextual cues. So this would be whether a culture is a high or low context culture. So should our communication be more explicit? Should we say exactly what we mean? Should we be more direct? Or should we be more polite and more subtle and maybe rely more on indirect cues and more on the cultural or contextual cues of that interaction? The first that I explained would be the low context culture. We're not relying a lot on the context for information because we are being more direct in our communication with others. We're saying exactly what we mean. High context cultures value that subtleness, maybe being more polite, being more indirect, and relying more kind of on the context, more like reading in between the lines here, right? Focusing on what's not being said as opposed to what's being said, because people may not be completely forthcoming in how they actually feel in high context cultures. We also know that cultures value in terms of high and low power distance, so how power should be and is distributed among members of that culture. So a low power distant cultures believe in the value of equality, so no one person or group should have excessive amounts of power over others, whereas high power distant cultures are the exact opposite. So power is distributed less evenly. There's a clear hierarchy in the distribution of power. And so thinking about power distance as a means of how power is distributed among members or groups in that culture. We also know that cultures vary in terms of how they value time. So if you're a monochronic culture, you treat time as a finite commodity that can be earned, saved, spent, and wasted. More monochronic cultures are very scheduled. You think about something like the military, you'll have policies like if you're on time, you're late, right? In our culture, we we expect people to be on time, we set deadlines, and we expect people to stick to them. But in more polychronic cultures, time is viewed more holistic and fluid. It's not very much prioritized, or if efficiency isn't necessarily a priority. Punctuality is not a priority, and so time is not necessarily seen as an infinite resource. So kind of the opposite of that monochronic perspective. We also can view cultures in terms of whether they are masculine and feminine. So more masculine cultures value traditional masculine values such as ambition and achievement. They value sex-specific roles for men and women. And feminine cultures value more kind of nurturance, quality of life, and service to others, and believe that men and women's roles should not be differentiated. So there should be more equality there in terms of those sex roles. The last dimension that we can think about here is, or second to last, sorry, is uncertainty avoidance. And so this is the level at which cultures or people in co-cultures welcome or shy away from uncertainty. So you can be highly uncertainty avoidant, and these cultures value people in situations that are familiar. They avoid taking risks. They have a fear of failure. Whereas more certainty accepting cultures prefer few kind of rules, few limitations to their behaviors. They enjoy new situations that are unique and unknown. So we can have kind of more uncertainty avoidant cultures or more uncertainty accepting cultures. And this is essentially just our viewpoint, or culture's viewpoint, on whether we like or value uncertainty, find that exciting, or whether we kind of find that undaunting and we want to have everything be really explicit and known to us. The last dimension is cultural communication codes. So a communication code is a verbal and nonverbal behavior whose meanings are often understood by only the people who are in the same culture or co-culture. And I've referred to some of these terms already. So in cultures we have idioms, or these are phrases whose meaning is purely figurative. So things like break a leg or kick the bucket. In our culture, we know what those things are. But if you're learning a new language, or you're learning the English language for the first time, you may not have the contextual background to understand when somebody tells you to break a leg before a performance, that they don't actually mean to break your leg, but they mean good luck. And so these can be really difficult as you're learning a new language. Jargon, I referenced this earlier. Jargon is language, technical language that has meaning understood only by people within a co-culture or a culture. So we can think about maybe like slang that is particular to a age group, but also thinking about the example I gave of the contractor in my house, as well as like the medical community having jargon that's very technical and specific. And finally, gestures. So I talked about this a little bit before as well. So movements, usually of the hand and arm. We've talked already about what gestures are. And gestures can vary widely between cultures. I talked about handshaking. We can also talk about the middle finger varying in terms of its meaning from culture to culture. All right, that sums up the first lecture for this chapter 2. In the next lecture, the second lecture of this series, we will talk about gender, sex and gender, and how that influences our communication.